The river didn't flood. It didn't rise. No one heard it move. By morning, it was somewhere else. Stories like this weren't written down in full. Most of what remains are fragments, accounts, pieces that stayed with the people who heard them. There are more of them in the hollow. Nora Hallett went to the bank at first light on the morning of June 12, 1878, carrying her water bucket the way she carried it every morning of every year she had been in the hollow, down the path from the house, through the lower pasture gate, to the river bank, where the flat stones made a good approach to the water. She had walked this path so many times that her feet knew it without her watching them, the specific slope and the specific stones and the specific sound of the river growing louder as she came down through the lower pasture. The river was louder that morning. She noticed this first, before she saw anything, the sound coming from the wrong direction. Not louder in volume, but louder in its presence, more immediate than it should have been on the path, as though the water were closer to her than usual. She was still in the lower pasture, still 20 yards from where the bank should have been, and the river sounded as though it were beside her. She came out of the lower pasture and stopped. The bank was wrong. The flat approach stones, the specific stones she had been stepping on for 11 years, the particular arrangement that her feet knew without her watching them, were not where they should be. The bank continued where they should have been, the earth dropping to dry ground rather than water. The river was not there. She looked to her left, which was north. The river was there, 20 yards north of where it had been the evening before, running in a channel she had never seen it run in, the sound of it coming from a direction that sound had never come from in 11 years of mornings in the lower pasture. Between her and the new channel was a 20-yard strip of exposed river floor, the stones and silt of the old bed lying open to the June morning, wet and dark, the bed of a river that was no longer a river. She stood at the old bank and looked at the new one. The new bank looked as though it had always been there. That was the first thing she noticed, the thing she would describe later as the wrongness that preceded all the other wrongness. The bank face on the south side of the new channel, the bank she was looking across the exposed bed toward, was a proper river bank. The worn face at the water line, the vegetation coming to the water's edge in the unhurried way of plants that had been growing toward water for years. The exposed soil above the water line showing the layers of a bank that had been there long enough to develop layers. The bank had not been there yesterday evening. It looked as though it had been there for years. She stood at the old bank for a moment longer, and then she picked up her bucket and walked north across the exposed old riverbed, strange underfoot, the damp silt and the flat stones of the former channel, the sky where the sky should be, and the water 20 yards away instead of at her feet. And she came to the new bank and stepped down to the water. She drew her bucket. The water was the same cold clarity of the Black Hollow River, the same mineral quality, the same river, just 20 yards north of where it had been. She went back to the house and told her husband what the river had done. The hollow in June of 1878 was a settlement of 9 families along the creek drainage that the river ran through on its way south to the larger water. The Black Hollow River, as it had been called since before anyone in the current settlement arrived, the name inherited from whoever had named it first and passed the name down through the years, was not a large river. In spring, it ran with the energy of snowmelt and rain, and in summer, it ran lower and clearer, and in late fall it sometimes ran shallow enough to ford in boots without much difficulty. But it was a river in the full sense, a permanent, year-round flow that the hollow depended on for water and for the ford crossing and for the mill upstream, and that was audible from most of the settlement's farms on a quiet night. People knew this river. not in the abstract way of people who lived near water, in the specific, daily practical way of people for whom the river was infrastructure. Nora Hallett had drawn from it every morning for 11 years. Thomas Gear had crossed the ford twice a week since 1866, going to and from the mill. The Cord children had played in it in the summers since they were old enough to play in water. The animals of the settlement's farms drank from it, were watered at it, were crossed over it. The river was the specific fact of daily life in the hollow that everything else was organized around. The farms had been built with the river in mind, their distances from it, their orientations toward it, the paths worn between houses and bank by the accumulated walking of years. The hollow had a relationship with the river that went past dependency into the specific intimacy of things that had shared a place for a long time. Nobody who had been in this hollow for more than a week would fail to notice if the river moved. The river had moved. Nora's husband Will came back with her to look, and then Thomas Gear came when Will told him at the fence, and by mid-morning the hollow had assembled at the bank in the way it assembled for anything that required collective attention. They came, and they stood at the edge of the old bank, and they looked at the 20 yards of exposed former riverbed, and they looked at the new bank where the river was running, and they held what they were seeing. The first thing people did was stand in silence. Not a long silence, a moment, the specific moment of a group of people receiving information that they were not immediately ready to process. Then the conversation began, and the conversation was the conversation of people who were practical and grounded and who needed to account for what was in front of them. Margaret Webb said, "Where was the ford?" Thomas Gear walked to where the ford had been, the specific stones he had stepped on twice a week for 12 years, and stood on the east bank above dry ground. He said, "Here. The ford was here." He looked at the dry riverbed below him, and then at the new channel 20 yards north. "The ford is somewhere over there now." He walked north along the bank to find it, and the others followed, and they located the new shallow crossing point by wading into the new channel at several points until they found where it was knee-deep and gravel-bottomed, crossable, though different from the old ford, different in the specific way that a crossing that was not the one you knew felt different under your feet. Will Hallett crossed the new ford and came back and said, "It'll do." He said it in the flat way of a man accepting an inconvenience. He said, "It'll do." He said, "It's not what it was, but it'll do." He looked at the old bed and said, "And that's just ground now." Nobody answered him. They stood on the bank and looked at the 20 yards of exposed river floor and at the new channel beyond it, and the morning moved on around them. Nora's husband Will came back with her to look, and then Thomas Gear came when Will told him at the fence, and by mid-morning the hollow had assembled at the bank in the way it assembled for anything that required collective attention. They came, and they stood at the edge of the old bank, and they looked at the 20 yards of exposed former riverbed, and they looked at the new bank where the river was running, and they held what they were seeing. The river was running in its new channel with the ease of a river that had been there for a long time. That was the first thing that several people said independently, that the new channel looked established. Not raw, not freshly torn, not the channel of water that had forced its way through new ground overnight. The banks of the new channel had the specific quality of riverbanks that had been riverbanks for years. The vegetation coming down to the water's edge in the unhurried way of plants that had grown toward water over time, the bank face worn smooth at the waterline. The stones in the channel bed settled and patient. Margaret Webb was the first to say it directly. She stood on the new bank and looked at the channel and said, "This looks like it's been here for years." Nobody contradicted her. Several people were thinking the same thing and waiting for someone to say it. She said, "The bank face is worn. You don't get a worn bank face overnight. The waterline wear takes years of water at the same level, wearing at the same stone." Clara Thorne said, "The plants." Margaret said, "Yes, look at the plants at the water's edge." She pointed. The root systems of the bank, vegetation visible at the waterline, the fine hair roots of the grass coming into the water, the larger roots of the low shrubs at the bank top extending down through the soil toward the channel. Those roots don't reach a new water source overnight. Those roots grew toward this channel over time. Thomas Gear crouched at the bank and looked at the stones in the water. He said, "These stones are placed." Nathan Birch, who was standing beside him, said, "What do you mean?" Thomas said, "River stones settle over time. A river works its stones in high water, and they settle when the water drops. Stones in a channel that moved last night look different from stones in a channel that has been there for years. These look like they've been there for years." Nathan said, "How long?" Thomas said, "Years. More than one. I've spent my whole life in and around river channels, and I know new stones from settled stones. These are settled." Nathan looked at the stones and said, "All right. I want to look at the whole transition. Don't disturb anything." He walked the full length of the change. He came back. He said, "To the hollow assembled on the bank. The new channel looks established. The banks, the stones, the plants, the waterline wear, all of it looks like a channel that has been here for a long time. I don't know how that's possible, given that the river was in the old channel yesterday evening, but that's what the ground says." The sound was what people came back to when they talked about it. The Black Hollow River was audible from the settlement on quiet nights. Not loudly, not the rushing dominance of a river in flood, but the constant low presence of moving water, the specific undertone that those who had been in the hollow long enough had stopped consciously hearing, but that was registered in the same way that a familiar clock was registered, noticed most clearly when it stopped. You knew the river was there because you could hear it. You knew it was at its normal level because the sound was at its normal register. If the river rose, the sound rose. If it fell, the sound fell. On the night of June 11th, the river moved 20 yards north and carved a new channel and left its old bed exposed. Nobody heard it. Nobody heard anything. People had been awake. The June nights were short and warm, and the Hollow's people slept with their windows open, and several of them had been awake at various points in the night, for the ordinary reasons that kept people awake in summer. What they heard and what they didn't hear became important in the morning's conversations, when the Hollow assembled and began to account for what the river had done. Clara Thorne had been awake from midnight until nearly 2 with her youngest, who had a summer fever. She lived on the west bank, the bank that was now the inner bank of the new channel, the bank that should have been cut in the night if the river had moved the way a river moved. She said, "I was awake for 2 hours. The river was there, quieter than usual, but there. At no point did I hear anything that sounded like the river changing. I was 20 yards from where the new bank is now. If the river had moved past me in the night, I would have heard it. I heard nothing." Ellen Cord, whose farm sat closer to the river than any other in the hollow, said, "My husband gets up at 2 most nights for water. He said the river was there when he went out. He said it sounded low, which he thought was weather. He came back inside and went back to bed. He was at the bank at 2 in the morning. He said the river was in its usual place. By 6, it was 20 yards north. The hollow held this. Old Samuel Pratt, who was 71 and who slept poorly, and who spent the summer nights in the chair by his window more often than in bed, said, "I heard the river all night. It was there, quieter than usual." He paused. "I've heard the river go quiet when the level drops in dry weather. I thought that was what it was. I thought nothing of it. I sat by my window until nearly 3. No sound of water moving in a new direction. No rush, no roar, nothing that you'd hear if water was cutting a new channel. I've heard flood water moving, and I've heard water undercutting a bank, and I know those sounds. I heard none of those sounds. I heard the river get quieter. That's all I heard." Will Hallett, who had been awake himself past 2, he was a man who woke in the small hours and had been for years, said, "I heard nothing wrong. The river was there. It sounded normal." He paused, except it was quiet. "Now that I think about it, it was quiet. Not gone, not absent, just less than I expected. I didn't think anything of it at the time." The Hollow assembled these accounts and found them consistent. The river had been present all night as sound, but quieter than its usual register. At least 4 people had been awake at various hours, 2 of them for extended periods, one of them within 20 yards of where the new bank now ran. Nobody had heard the river move. Nobody had heard the specific sounds of a river changing course, the roar of a sudden breach, the grinding of a bank giving way, the rush of water finding a new path. The night had been quiet in the specific way of a night in which the expected sounds were present, but reduced, the way sounds reduced when they moved to a different room. What the quietness had been was the river finding its new channel. This was Nathan Birch's accounting, offered the following day after he had spent a full day thinking about it and examining the ground. He said, "A river moving from one channel to another. If it moved gradually, if the transition took most of the night, would go quiet first." He said, "The flow would be dividing, some going the old way and some going the new, and the total sound would be less than the full river in a single channel." He said, "That division would sound like low water." He said, "That's the sound explanation. It's the only one I have." He paused. "It doesn't explain the banks. It doesn't explain the stones. Those things are not consistent with a river that moved last night. Those things are consistent with a river that has been in its new channel for a long time. I have 2 sets of evidence, and they contradict each other, and I don't know how to hold them both honestly." What they still could not explain was how no one had heard it. This wasn't the only account that stayed that way. There were others, from the same places, that didn't close either. Nathan Birch had been reading ground for 30 years. He had been in the Hollow since 1848, had farmed its soil in every condition it produced, had watched its water in every season and every flood year and every drought year. He was 61 years old, and he was the person the Hollow went to when it needed ground to be read, because he had the specific accumulated knowledge of a man who had paid careful attention to the same piece of landscape for 3 decades, and who had learned, in that paying of attention, to see what the ground said about its own history. He spent the better part of June 12th walking the transition zone alone. He asked the others to let him do it alone, which they did, because they understood that Nathan walking ground needed the specific silence of a man working, not the company of people who would ask questions before he had answers. The old riverbed. He walked it from the ford crossing north to where the channel bent, a distance of perhaps 200 yards, and he walked slowly and looked at everything. The silt and stones of the riverbed were damp, not the saturated damp of ground that had just lost its water cover, which would have been muddy, soft, showing the marks of birds and small animals. The damp was older than that. The ground had the specific moisture of river floor that had been drying for longer than a day. He pressed his hand into the silt at several points and read the consistency. The silt was telling him something he did not want to hear. It was telling him it had been drying for more than a night. The old bank faces, the walls of the former channel, showed layered stratigraphy. Fine silt at the bottom, the work of decades, medium gravel above it, mixed sediment at the top. Each layer a record of time, compressed and old. He pressed his palm into the bank face. Compact. The firmness of soil that had been in its position for a long time. A fresh cut was a soft face, a crumbling face, a face that gave you material when you pressed it. This face gave him nothing. He walked to the new channel. The south bank of the new channel, the bank that should have been cut fresh in the last 24 hours, showed the same qualities. The same layering, the same compaction. He pressed his palm into it, the same firmness. He stood at the new bank for a long time without moving. He said to Thomas Gear, who was waiting at the field's edge, "Come here." Thomas came. Nathan pressed Thomas's hand into the new bank face. He said, "What does that feel like?" Thomas said, "Firm." Nathan said, "Yes, that's a bank that has been a bank for a long time, not last night. That firmness takes months at minimum." Thomas said, "But the river was here last night, in the old channel." Nathan said, "Nora Hallett drew water from the old bank at 6 o'clock yesterday evening. The river was there." Thomas said, "So the banks are old, but the move was last night." Nathan said, "That is what the evidence says. I've been reading ground for 30 years, and I cannot explain it. The banks are old. The move was last night. Those two things cannot both be true, and they both are." He walked back to the old bed and crouched and pressed his palm to the damp silt. He said, "And this?" Thomas said, "It just dried out." "Of course it's damp." Nathan said, "Yes, check it tomorrow." Thomas checked it the following day. Still damp. He checked it at the end of the week after 2 dry days had passed. The surrounding ground was dry. The old river bed was damp. He told Nathan. Nathan said, "I thought so." River ground holds moisture longer than surrounding ground. The root structures, the silt composition, the orientation to the water table, but not indefinitely. Without a water source, the moisture dissipates. It may take a long time, but it dissipates. Check it in a month. They checked it in a month. The old riverbed was damp. The hollow adjusted to the new river in the practical way of people who had no alternative to adjustment. Learning the new channel, locating the new ford, discovering where the new deep sections were, and where the new shallows allowed easy crossing. The adjustment took a few weeks, and then the new river was the river, and the old bed was the old bed, and life in the hollow returned to its ordinary patterns. Mostly. The ford crossing was 20 yards north of where it had been, and it was a good ford. The new channel was shallow at that point in a way that served the crossing well, and within a month most of the hollow was using it without thinking about where the old ford had been. Thomas Gear crossed it twice a week to the mill, and by July he could not have told you exactly where the old crossing had been without walking the bank to find the reference points. The paths changed. The hollow's paths were defined by where they needed to go, and where they needed to go was the river, and the river was now 20 yards north of where it had been, and so the paths shifted north by 20 yards, and the old paths became grass again. This happened gradually, the way things became grass again, the footfall decreasing as people took the new route, and the old route losing the compression that kept the grass down, and then the grass rising, and then by October you had to look to see where the old path had run. Will Hallett's new path to the river passed over what had been the river's mid-channel 6 months earlier. He walked over it every morning to draw water, and in the autumn he planted it with the field that had been cut off by the old course, and that could now be farmed without the ford complication. He turned the plow through the old riverbed in September, and the soil was good, dark and rich with the silt of years, and he thought about what he was planting in, and what it had been, and he planted it anyway. He mentioned to Nathan in passing that the soil was good. Nathan said, "River silt, the best soil there is. The river did Hal it a favor, if you want to look at it that way." Will said, "I suppose it did. I still don't walk to the new bank at night." Nathan said, "No?" Will said, "I know that probably sounds—" Nathan said, "No, I don't either. I've crossed that ford more times than I can count since June. In the daylight, it feels like a ford. I have never crossed it at night. I've had reason to cross it at night twice since June, and both times I found another way." Will said, "It's the old bed, I think. You cross the old bed to get to the ford. 20 yards of ground that used to be the river. In the daytime, it's just ground. At night, I don't want to cross it." Nathan said, "I know what you mean. They left it at that. That was the specific quality of that adjustment, the quiet parallel behavior that didn't get named." Clara Thorne had said it directly. "I don't go to the river at night anymore." She said it without apology, without explanation she trusted enough to offer. Others said similar things, without exactly saying them, adjusting their timing, finding the daylight hours sufficient, not pressing themselves on the matter. It was not fear, or not exactly fear. It was the behavior of people who had been shown something by the place they lived in, and who had decided, without articulating the decision, that the nighttime river was a different thing than it had been before June 11th. That the river had done something in the night, and that the night was where it had done it, and that the night and the river were now associated in a way they hadn't been before. Old Samuel Pratt said, "The new river sounds different at night." Clara Thorne said, "Different how?" He said, "Quieter." I know that sounds like what I said about the night it moved, that the river was quieter than usual, that I thought it was low water. This is different from that. The river in the old channel had a specific sound from my window, not loud, not prominent, but a particular sound, the sound of that water in that place, and I had been hearing it from that window for 7 years, and I knew it the way you knew a sound you had heard every night for 7 years without thinking about it. The new channel's sound is different. It comes from a different direction, which I expected. But it is also quieter than a river of that size in that location should be. The water volume is the same. The channel width is similar. There is no reason for the new river to be quieter than the old one. But it is. Nathan Birch walked the new bank in the evenings and listened for himself, the way he had been walking the new bank since June. He confirmed what Samuel had said. The new river was quieter than the old one had been, at the same distance from his own property. He had tried to account for it, the new channel's orientation, the bank height, the bed material. All of these things affected a river's sound. He had considered each one and found partial accounts and no satisfying complete account. He said, "I can tell you the new river is quieter than the old one, and I can tell you the old river was quiet the night it moved. There's something about the quietness of this river that I can't explain. It was quiet when it moved, and it's been quiet since. I don't know if those things are related. I noticed them being related, and I don't have an explanation for it. Those two things together give me an uneasy feeling that I don't have a name for." Nora Hallett drew from the new bank every morning of every year after June 12th, 1878. She drew from it the way she had drawn from the old bank. Early. The path down through the lower pasture, the bucket in her hand, the river sounds growing as she came down through the field. The path was 20 yards longer now, going north to find the new bank. And the new bank was a different bank. The stones different, the angle different, the sound of the water slightly different in its register. She learned the new bank the way she had learned the old one. Over months, and then years, the new bank became the bank, the only bank she thought of when she thought of the bank. The old path grassed over, and she stopped seeing it as a path. But she went back to the old bank once. She went in the autumn of that year, in October, when the hollow was turning and the air was the specific cool of an early fall morning. She walked out of habit to where the old path had been, and picked her way down to the old bank's edge, and stood there. The old bank was grassed over at the top, and the face was softening in the way that bank faces softened when they stopped being cut by water. The sharp edge rounding, the exposed soil beginning to be covered. At the bottom of the old bank face, the old riverbed extended away from her, damp even in October, the specific darkness of wet ground. She stood at the old bank and looked at the old bed and listened. The new river was audible to the north, the sound of it coming from the wrong direction, the way it had come from the wrong direction on the morning she found it. She had adjusted to that. The sound came from north, and that was normal now. She listened to the old bed. She did not know what she was listening for. Something, maybe in the damp ground, some echo of the water that had run there, some persistence of the river in the place it had been. She stood there for a few minutes, and she heard only the October hollow and the new river from the north. She picked up her bucket and walked to the new bank. She drew her water and went back to the house. The account of the Black Hollow River's movement passed into the hollow's institutional memory the way unusual things passed into institutional memory, carefully, specifically, attached to the particular details that made it unusual, rather than letting those details soften in the retelling. People told it precisely. The morning of June 12th, the river 20 yards north. The old bed exposed, no flood damage, no debris. The banks that looked settled, the stones that looked placed. They told it the way you told something that had happened and that you wanted to keep as the thing that had happened, rather than let it become a story. Nathan Birch wrote it down. He kept a farm journal, not a diary, not a record of personal matters, but the practical notebook of a man who tracked the land he worked and the water he depended on. The entries were usually brief. Weather, soil condition, water levels, work done. The June 12th entry was longer than most. He wrote, "The Black Hollow River shifted its course approximately 20 yards north overnight on June 11th. No flood. Event preceded the shift. No sound was reported during the night by any person who was awake. The old bed is exposed and remains damp. The new channel's banks have the character of long-established banks. The channel stones are settled. I have examined the ground carefully, and I cannot reconcile the physical evidence of old banks and settled stones with the testimony of people who drew water at the old channel on the evening of the 11th. The physical evidence says the new channel is not new. The testimony says the old channel held water until yesterday evening. I continue to check the old bed for moisture. It remains damp. In late July, he wrote, "The old bed is still holding moisture. 2 weeks of dry weather, and the surrounding ground is dry. The old bed is damp." In September, he wrote, "I planted the south corner of the field today and turned plow through the section of the old bed nearest the farm. The soil is excellent. Deep silt, the kind you only get from long water deposit. Good soil from a long-gone river. It will grow well. The bed is still damp where I have not plowed it. In November he wrote, "First frost, and the old bed is damp under the frost. I do not have an explanation for this that satisfies me. At some point in the winter, I have been thinking about the silence. I have a theory, which I record here. Rivers move over time. The Black Hollow River has been in this hollow since before any current person arrived, and it has moved before, incrementally, in ways we could not see. What I am wondering is whether the night of June 11th was not a sudden move, but a completion, whether the river had been moving toward this new channel for years, in increments too small to observe, and the 11th was simply the night the accumulated movement finished. If that is true, the banks would be old because they had been forming for years. The stones would be settled because they had been settling for years. The move that looked sudden was not sudden. It was the last step of a very long process. This theory accounts for the physical evidence. It does not account for the silence. A river completing a channel change, even gradually, even as a final step, still moves water through a new path on the night it completes. Still makes the sounds of water finding new ground. Still wakes the animals in the farms along the bank. No animal was disturbed. No one heard anything unusual. Nora Hallett's dog slept through the night. The silence is the part I cannot account for. The silence is the part that stays with me. He closed the journal and went to check the old bed. It was damp. By morning, the river had settled into its new course. No one in the hollow said they heard it move, and no one could explain how that much water had passed in the night without a sound. The old riverbed remained. It stayed damp through the summer, and through the fall, and through the following winter, the surrounding ground going dry, and then wet, and then dry again with the seasons, and the old bed holding its moisture, the way old riverbeds held the memory of water, as though the river had not entirely left, as though some part of what had flowed there was still flowing. In whatever sense, flow could continue in ground from which the water had been withdrawn. Nathan Birch checked it every month. Every month it was damp. He wrote in his journal, at the end of the year, "The old bed is still holding moisture." I have no explanation for this that satisfies me. The river is in its new channel. The old channel is dry by any measure that counts as dry except this one. The ground is damp. I don't know what the ground remembers. I don't know if ground remembers. I know that this ground is behaving as though it does. The river moved in the night and no one heard it. The old bed stayed damp and no one can explain it. The new river is quieter than it should be. I have recorded the facts. The facts do not close. He put down his pen and went to bed, and the hollow was quiet around him, and the new river ran in its new channel 20 yards north of where it had run the night before. Quiet in the way it was always quiet now. The sound of it reaching his window at a register slightly below. What a river of that size should produce, in a hollow that size on a still night. The specific quietness that Samuel Pratt had named, and that Nathan had confirmed, and that neither of them had found a satisfactory explanation for. The hollow slept. The river ran. And somewhere in the ground of the old bed, 20 yards south of where the water now moved, the moisture held. Not the damp of a surface recently uncovered. Not the moisture that dissipated over weeks and months as the seasons came and went. The specific persistent damp of ground that held what it held, that did not dry in the dry weather and did not change with the season's changes. Nathan Birch checked it every month of the following year and found it damp every time. He had no explanation that satisfied him. He had the facts. The river moved without a sound. The banks looked old when they should have been new. The old bed stayed wet when it should have dried. The new river ran quieter than a river of that size should run. He had the facts and no account that held them. He kept checking the old bed. He kept listening to the new river in the evenings, and the hollow went on around him, the farms, the paths worn to the new bank, the children who grew up with the new ford and who would not remember the old one. The hollow went on, and the river ran in its new channel quietly, the way it had been running since the night it moved without making a sound. Patient, as though it had always been there, as though it had always been going to be there, as though the night of June 11th, 1878, had simply been the night the river finished arriving. Some of these accounts were never meant to be explained, only remembered. If you've been listening, you already know how they tend to end. There are more of them.